Welcome to my Theory of Everything, Except Physics, Lecture 5. Now this is a little bit out of order since I've only posted Lecture 1, and I've given this series before, but at this point I've put so much online in my other videos that I feel like I can almost skip a lot of the details that are involved in Lectures 2, 3, and 4. Also, I'm going to use this as an intentional attempt to practice speaking like a normal human without too much speed and without having a script. So we're going to see how this goes. I'm sure it's a skill that I'll need to practice. So let me start with a review of Lecture 1 and also Lectures 2, 3, and 4, which I haven't given yet. Well, I've actually given these in person at some point, but I have not actually put them up anywhere. But Lecture 1, I talked about the three core components of my theory of everything, which is a unique way in which individuals are teleologically directed towards personal development as they meet their needs. So this could be considered eudaimonia. So that is a teleological drive. Now, what they're teleologically driven to do is to unite and integrate their various needs, desires, and interests into a workable model that works within the context of their environment. So this is integrity is the second concept. So telos, integrity, and then what are they trying to integrate is the three parts, the three different operating systems humans have, the left hemisphere, the right hemisphere, and the body. So this is mind and emotions, you can say, and body. But the emotions aren't really what we tend to think of as emotions. But I'll get to that in Lecture 3. Lecture 2 was a more detailed description of the philosophic nature the philosophic undergirding of my theory, in that we each must use intentional, self-conscious self-criticism to attain free will. And this kind of free will is just a means of getting an objective viewpoint on our basic needs so that we can get to the point of integrating them. So this is the basic tool for this is self-doubt. Self-doubt is the only thing that allows you to correct yourself, and it is actually the basis of a solid epistemology. So Lecture 2 is really epistemological and philosophic stance. Lecture 3 is the one about emotions, and I've done this to death on this channel. I have said all kinds of things about the nature of our pattern recognition process and how that communicates to our intellectual process via emotions. These are two different intellectual operating systems. One is looking for deductive logic. The left hemisphere looks for 1 + 1 = 2 always. That's a yes or no. It's a binary system. The right hemisphere, however, looks for pattern recognition and large groups. So it's an inductive logical process. It's not illogical, and this is where we get into some difficulties in understanding ourselves. It's information that you're receiving from your emotions, and it can be wrong just like your digital, intellectual, left hemispheric process can be wrong. So we blame it too much when it's wrong or when it gives us conflicting or confusing information. But it is information. So Lecture 3 would have been about how one organizes and pulls the information out of that. If you want to look at my Borderline series, you can definitely find all the places that I've described. Basically everything that I probably would have covered in Lecture 3. I haven't gone piece by piece and looked at it, but it's probably got most of it in there. Lecture 4 would be on the psychosomatic interactions of mind and body and how they are much more connected than we give them credit for. It's basically going through the body's operating system because the body can think for itself. There's a great example of people being given playing cards that they win or lose money. And the body is actually physiologically responsive to the rewards and punishments of intellectually knowing that it's winning money and has more information about which stack to draw from. If you want to read this, I think it was in Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink, but it could be somewhere else. I can't remember. But the body actually recognized which deck of cards was more likely to give it a reward or a punishment than before even the emotional pattern recognition or the intellect had been able to separate out that decision making. So the body has its own operating system that's very physical, very based in the real world, and this is also part of what happens with trauma. Is the body remembers. That's actually the name of a book, which is an interesting book. But anyway, to move on from here, the point here is that all of these things are giving us different kinds of information. They're understanding the world in different ways, and sometimes they conflict with each other. Going back to the original lecture of integration, if we want to integrate these three operating systems into a working, functional process to accomplish our needs and free us up from repeating past baggage or from improper, painful learning is a good way to describe trauma is past painful learning. And the brain learns it very well, and it applies it in incorrect situations, and therefore we end up having flashbacks or reminders that make us freak out about things that we believe to be dangerous when they are not actually dangerous, although our memory may think they are. So this difficult and inconsistent learning pattern in which our three operating systems are receiving potentially contradicting information about their experiences are what we need to integrate as we move teleologically through a process of personal development. So now that I've caught us up very quickly to Lecture 5, this is a description of the teleological developmental process. Now, the goal of literally everything I put out is to say things you've never heard before, because why would I just repeat something someone else has said? And I guess the goal of this one is to come off smoother as I'm trying to discuss them without getting distracted. My ADD either makes me move at 1,000,000 miles an hour or it just wanders off in the middle of a sentence. So, working on it. Okay, here we go. So, the developmental process here, you may have heard parts of these. I'm going to have to review various things, and we'll probably get more obscure as we go along. I have a visual representation of this that would make it much easier, but I don't think I'm going to actually create that or recreate that for my slides or in the video or anything. I think I'm just going to leave up a single picture here. But let me imagine, if you have seen Maslow's pyramid of development, then we can start from that as a good conceptualization. Although what I'm going to do is make essentially two pyramids, one on top of the other, one pointing up and one pointing down. That's going to be my picture. But let's start with Maslow. Maslow had a 5-stage of development. And by the way, I'm doing this literally without any notes. I've got like 4 bullet points written just to remind me to hit all the major topics. So this is also maybe a pinch disorganized. But anyway, so Maslow had his 5 basic developmental stages. It starts off with your basic, what I'm going to call biological, although I think he said physiological, and I think there was an argument for that. I want to say biological needs on the bottom. Above that, we have safety needs. Above that, we have love and belongingness needs. Above that, we have self-esteem. And above that, we have self-actualization. That was his conceptualization. Now, I really like what he did, and I also like the fact that he was a significant believer in more of a Karl Popper kind of scientific process, and he didn't want to just do philosophy. He wanted to be able to test what he was saying and show it enacted in the real world, and he was able to do some of this. The problem is he would have been better as a philosopher, and I think he could get more attention that way. The problem is, as you try to come up with these constructs, who's going to test all this stuff? At some point in the future, they end up just like kind of saying, oh, yeah, this is a good idea, and people start using it, but they don't actually do anything practical with it. It's just not in the nature of those who study counseling or psychology. And also, I think PhD students are kind of useless, but that's another story. Trying not to get distracted again. Let's get back on task. So, his 5 stages. I really love those 5 stages. And let me give you a picture of how that works. If we're looking for, if we are programmed, if our experiences do not allow us to progress forward in a natural way, then our tendency will be to fulfill only our basic biological needs. Food, sleep, sex, whatever. The basic biological drives that we have as a entity, as a physical animal. And so these are obviously going to rely heavily on the body-based operating system, which I had, can talk about with psychosomatic disorders, which I would mention in Lecture 4. But beyond that, there is a need for our present tense current needs. Now, how, including like food, if I'm hungry right now, that becomes the most important thing. And if somebody lives in just this one stage for long enough, they don't care about anything you might say in terms of morality or whatever. They're just an animal. They're just going to get their food needs met or whatever, and they'll kill you for the food you may have. This lowest level of animal behavior, though, is not the highest version. So, like, as one moves up this pleasure, well, I shouldn't get into that yet. As one moves up this particular level, then one recognizes, well, it's better for me to prepare for food I may need in the future than to just have food now. And so then you move to squirrels and hiding food so you can use it in the future. But this process, the idea of developing this need into a future-based direction, then moves into the next level, which is safety. One of the problems that Maslow had is he didn't describe exactly how and why one is able to move between the stages. And this is a significant problem for him. I'm going to be able to give you that picture when I talk about closure processes, and this is how one moves between stages. And I've also talked about this in other videos. I think I have a short video on how to get closure. But that closure is essentially coming to grips with an ability to meet a need at one of Maslow's stages and moving on to the next. But I'm only going to use Maslow for a little while here, so let me keep moving. So after you decide I'm going to meet my safety needs now and then into the future, and you start becoming future-oriented, meet my food needs now, and you move that into the future, then I become future-oriented, and then I'm talking about safety, like food security, or physical security if I don't want to be rained on or don't want to get a cold or something. So these safety needs are the natural development of the recognition of ourselves in the future and the application of this thinking and future-based process to the first base biological needs. Now we move to safety needs. As we are in that section, then what becomes better as we move past this stage to the higher levels? It becomes easier for me to create safety in the future if I work cooperatively with others. So you'll have pack animals that work and team up and take down, like, deer or whatever. This is the highest level of development towards our safety needs, and that also starts working into Maslow's next level, which is love and belongingness. The animals that find a way to work in a pack are more effective than those that work individually, and that also further and better supports their safety needs. So, as you see, as we go up, this is the point of the eudaimonia as the fulfillment. These stages aren't against each other, and one can certainly be thrown by circumstances back into previous stages. But as we go forward and through these stages, each becomes another dimension, another developmental process added upon the first that better enables the first to do what it's supposed to be doing. So we move from the safety needs into love and belongingness, and I recognize my place in the herd and my place in the group, and that my ability to please the group becomes part of my ability to get my basic safety needs met, and then my basic physiological needs. And after you get some distance up or start living in this area contextually, then you no longer think about those basic food and shelter and sleep. You don't think about those needs as much because those are provided for by the social reality created in the love and belongingness stage. But there is a certain amount of insecurity in my love and belongingness because, to some extent, that only relies on my ability to perform, or my place in the hierarchy is determined based on my performance and ability to specialize in some way, provide a unique role in the group. So I may go to the top of the hierarchy to some degree, or may want to go to the top of the hierarchy, and that sort of makes me less dispensable for the group. They won't likely kick me out if I'm very capable of providing something. But this becomes the next question that says, who am I as a person? What can I give as an individual? And this is where I start judging myself within the context with this jury sitting on my shoulder, judging my behavior, and says, who are you and what are you doing and what are you as a unique person? And that, of course, moves us up from the love and belongingness stage into the self-esteem stage, where I am making judgments about my performance and the responsibilities I perceive for myself and take on for myself. And this is what Maslow labels self-esteem. I hate the term self-esteem. I think it's absolutely useless. You can talk about self-efficacy. You can talk about not having a sense of shame. You can talk about seeing yourself as a valuable person. Self-esteem is a blob of nothing. But that's another rant that I'll try to save for later if I can avoid getting distracted. So, the self-esteem needs, as I see and am judging myself and what I believe my role is in the world, as I judge that positively, as I say, this is who I am and this is what I believe, this is what I can create for the world, and I'm able to use that to find my place. As I do that, once I get comfortable with that, then I can move up into his idea of self-actualization. Now, he did a lot of interesting research with people he called self-actualizers, and he showed various things about their independence from the rest of society, plus the moral nature that's created by this freedom, because they've already gone through the process of judging themselves, so they're not without judgment, without the moral constraints that one would hope that a person has, but they're also not coming from those moral constraints by way of societal influence. They're not being pushed into something. like one would if you were in the love and belongingness stage, where you're just peer responsive. Like the peers decide what is good and what is bad, and I need to please them, otherwise I get kicked out of the tribe. Once you've passed this, once you have eudamoniously evolved through those stages, then one gets to the point of self-judgment where your own moral applications are much more important, and then you are free for self-creation, which is going to be what I rename that stage. So now we have a pretty good rough and tumble picture of what human development is like and why it happens. But of greater interest here, we have really only started off with the ways in which our animal natures or our physiological operating system understands the world. This conceptualization is actually very body-based in its nature. It starts off and continues through the animalistic development of that first basic primary biological operating system. The physiological operating system. Now to this, I'm going to add the developmental theory of Lawrence Kohlberg. He had a 6-stage developmental theory, which I think really parallels well with Maslow, and the stages match up quite well, but the problem is one's 5 and one is 6. So how does one reconcile these two, and what are the differences? Now let me say Lawrence Kohlberg's moral theory of moral development isn't looking at the same kinds of questions as Maslow's. But his moral theory is broken into 3 phases, a preconventional, conventional, and postconventional phase, and each of those are broken into 2 stages each. In the first stage, the preconventional, we have avoiding punishment as the primary moral determination, which is really pre-moral, that's why it's preconventional. So the idea here is the same as Maslow's developmental biological. I'm going to avoid being hungry, so therefore I want to avoid being hungry and the punishment of hunger pain, so therefore I eat something. And if that requires me to kill somebody or something to get that, I'll do that. There's no other moral considerations at that point. The second level builds on this theme in the same way that Maslow's safety second level builds on his first biological level. Maslow's discussion of safety needs were a way to meet the biological needs on the next day, week, whatever, in the future. And in the similar way, the stage 2 of the moral development process Kohlberg describes is trying to find a better means of seeking rewards and avoiding punishments. So this is the fairness level that little children get into. I didn't get enough cake and blah, blah, blah. The idea is still ego-driven, self-centered, but at the same time, there is an idea of balance and rules and having some kind of process or structure that one can follow in order to better meet their needs. This becomes a kind of constraint or at least expectation for the future that one can follow in order to hopefully have those needs better met. This is quite reminiscent of Dawkins talking about the various kinds of games one can play and strategies that can be used in his book, The Selfish Gene, in order to maximize returns. So after this pre-conventional first 2 stages, then one moves into the conventional phase, and that has the 2 stages. And the first one has often been called the good boy or good girl section, which really matches also, again, well with Maslow, where he has the idea of has the idea of love and belongingness, and that's good boy or good girl. Like you're being judged by the group, and your behavior is determined based on how well it fits in with the group norms. So this is how we judge ourselves and take in that system from outside based only on people's liking of you. Not any kind of philosophical structure yet, not necessarily, but, if I follow the rules, then I'm good. If I don't follow the rules, I'm bad, but that's good or bad based on the relationships, not on any kind of philosophic structure that's being applied to my behavior. If I'm in a gang, then there are rules that make me a good or bad gang member, but they have nothing to do with any kind of objective morality. And we can see developmentally how this works really well with children in the 8 or 9 years old before they hit puberty, and how they're telling on each other because they want to seek primarily the approval of the adult. They'll move towards the peers later, but in general, it is the looking for the judgment of a parent, and or an adult of some kind, the pre-programming. And that judgment doesn't have to be, obviously, if you have 6 situations where parents will reward their kids for being horrible human beings by an objective moral standard, then this becomes something that we condemn in children, or would say that's, you've made a horrible monster out of this person. But at the same time, that's the way they're pre-programmed, because hopefully we can direct those behaviors in socially acceptable ways later on. But then let's add the next stage. So see, again, we still have Maslow and Kohlberg working very well in tandem. The next stage is where they break, and this is where it gets really interesting. Because the next stage for Maslow, and for what I was saying in terms of like you want to develop your own unique place in the group for self-esteem, for Lawrence Kohlberg, the next stage is law and order, where one takes that, one develops a more objective view of their behavior based on specifically rule following. This is a deontologically philosophic stance of X behavior is wrong, Y behavior is right. That's what I need to do. And the recognition that there's, full recognition that this is what holds society together, and without it we are thrown into chaos and, die and work our way back down the hierarchy here and starve to death. Or are forced down the hierarchy because we are starving to death. So it's interesting from one perspective, we're talking about the ultimate level of conformity, following all the rules is moral, versus the ultimate level of individuality, which is where do I fit in the group and how can I be a unique person? This is not an opposition, actually. This is the challenge of, hopefully, adolescence. I need to both be my own person as well as be a functional member of the group. So here's where it gets really interesting for me, because I'm going to pull into this stage. The resolution of this stage requires the ideas of Jung and Joseph Campbell. This is the hero's journey that everyone has to take in order to become a fully functional adult, to get that individuation process completed, to not be hanging on to baggage, to not be replaying the scripts that were given to us by childhood. One has to struggle between provision and protection of the society as a functional structure, as well as forcing my own unique individuality to work well and to find a place I can support that structure while also supporting myself, my family, my needs, whatever else. So this is the hero's journey as described by as the monomyth in Joseph Campbell, which is funny because we hear a lot about this now from Jordan Peterson, and he really doesn't seem to like Joseph Campbell at all. When I read, like 3 times I read Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning, and I think he mentions Joseph Campbell in there like twice, and it's just because he kind of has to, even though I think Campbell's just absolutely really amazing. He's also a little bit of Fruit Loop, so I get why Peterson isn't thrilled with him, but I'm off on a tangent now. Anyway, the point is that Joseph Campbell lays out his idea of the monomyth, and his monomyth is the developmental process, or I should say the narrative process that's followed through every various culture. It's changed in different ways, but a lot of the stories are similar. It doesn't matter who and where you are or where you're from, but the idea being that this is a human anthropological developmental process that he's trying to unearth, excavate. There we go. So he's excavating this developmental process in the same way that Jordan Peterson is talking about Maps of Meaning, like this is some kind of encoded wisdom that is then passed on. A recognition that these stories are really the only way my great-great-grandfather has to give me information, because for one, he may not be philosophically inclined and able to describe how to live the best life. If I talk to him now, he may have wonderful amounts of wisdom that he could have passed on to my great-grandfather and my grandfather. They may have had wonderful wisdom, but have you ever tried to really talk to an older person and say, teach me what you know? I've talked to some very wise older people, and they have no ability to express that. That information is trapped within them, and you have to, I call it mining. You have to mine the old people to try to interpret the wisdom out of what they're saying, because they can't and they're not inclined towards doing that themselves. That doesn't mean they don't have it. My aunt is a wonderful human being, and I think she has lived an exemplary life. The question is, if you put her in a room with any kind of philosopher, probably any kind of college student, I mean, she's just got a high school education, and she's, 80 years old. They're going to be able to talk rings around her. That doesn't mean that they can live a better life than she does. So I have to mine from her the wisdom that she has used to live her life without having, and also provide for that the philosophic supports. Now, this may sound like I'm a bit off topic, but I want to say this is the point that the monomyth was able to do. If she's able to pass on stories to me of her life, if those stories are good enough in terms of their ability to distill the wisdom and the behavior and the values that she had, the attention that she, and where she directed, the idea of where she directed her attention during these stories, then I can learn from those stories how I can better live my life, even if she's unable to philosophically describe it or psychologically describe it or whatever. And these stories end up being retasked, retooled, reformed, and passed on as fairy tales or religion or whatever have you. But this passed on, encrypted, encoded wisdom is then given to our children. So my great-grandfather, who also had the same similar religious background that I do, was able to pass that on, and I have his religious stories, even though I don't have him. But in a way, they are a better encrypted is probably the wrong word there. They're a better encoded, packaged. I say encrypted because I think about how you take a file on a computer and you compressed. They're a very highly compressed and organized system of what worked for him. And so passing this down, I can take this and decrypt it and decode it and find in the stories themselves, in the religious adherents, a better way of living and solving problems that I confront in my life, because we are all human, all too human. And therefore, we are all going to have confronted and have to deal with the same kinds of reactions. He may have solved a problem. He may not be able to tell me how he solved that problem if I ask him directly, but he can give me a story that helped him solve that problem, and I may be able to use that same story to help myself. This is also what I would have talked about in lecture 1, 2, 3. But anyway, you get the idea now. So these this monomyth is what helps us get a construct, what helps us construct our view of how we can resolve the individual versus society question, which really becomes the left-right question, which becomes the question of social reality versus physical reality, the things you can actually do in the real world versus the things people want you to do or their expectations, and how those things are often in conflict with each other. And the society can actually kill you and destroy your ability to work in the physical world. But also, if you work well enough in the physical world, then you can take over the society. These things are not opposed, even though the left and right can't ever communicate, because they operate primarily on one versus the other operating system. In terms of, this is typically the right hemispheric social versus the left hemispheric digital dichotomy. And so, and actually, as I mentioned that, since to go back to the idea of telos and the integration of the three different parts of ourselves, the trinity we are, the body, the emotions, and the intellectual process. The integration of these parts with themselves, because we have different thoughts and different feelings, and we have to integrate them first with themselves before they can integrate with each other. But these are each their own kind of dialectic. So there is an intellectual dialectic, there's an emotional dialectic, and then there's a physical dialectic. And they have these it's very three-dimensional in that way. So we have these three dimensions of the person that operate over time, so that'd be a fourth dimension too. But we have these three dimensions of a person, which each have to make sense out of themselves, rather than being overweighted towards, like the body could be overweighted towards avoiding physical exertion, or toward being addicted to physical exertion if you're a marathoner, or in some way being emotionally overreactive or emotionally underreactive, or it could be over-intellectualizing or under-intellectualizing. You're seeing the spectrum that's being created on each of these dimensions. And as these dialectics first resolve themselves towards the golden mean in the middle, and then resolve the way they attempt to meet their needs with the ways that the other two attempt to meet their needs, this integration is the telos we're driven toward, and this integrity is what makes the individual functional, useful, and happy. So going back to this developmental model that we have of Kohlberg and Maslow side by side, so this question of the monomyth and the resolution of this huge problem of the individual versus society, as we come to our own place of fitting in within as ourselves, respecting ourselves in a context which we also respect, so that's the social and the individual, as we are able to meet these two together, then we're able to move past that level and towards self-creation, which is up on the next sphere for Maslow. Maslow would say the next level is a sphere. I already jumped ahead. So he would say the next phase, I guess, is the post-conventional. And the post-conventional is where one gets into more of the philosophic ideas. They're moving past to a morality based on something more than their feelings or their logical understanding, towards a more integrated picture of what is important and what makes things important, what gives things value, and how do I create that value. So in the fifth stage, remember the post-conventional, like the other two phases, is broken in half, and so the stage 5 for Kohlberg is the world divided into a concept of human rights. Now, this also creates a lot of problems because people can go fishing into the higher levels and pull this concept of rights back into a deontological or just purely behavioristic stance from the lower levels and abuse it to heck. But the idea here is a recognition that the morals that created the deontological, the rules-based lower levels, the law and order, should be based on some kind of larger goals. And what are these goals and how are they defined? Well, I need to, as a member of society, make sure my goals both support the society as well as an individual, make sure those goals fit the individual. And an idea of individual rights is a good integration of those two competing interests. And so stage 5 for Maslow is going to have that. Laws are regarded as a thing we can use to best enact that balance. Again, this question and the stage 6 question that comes next both fit well under Maslow's idea of self-actualization. It is the individual divorced from the specific connection, almost in a Buddhist sense of being beyond, and one who observes from a distance the process of law rather than an engagement in it. But not just law, just any kind of deontological expectation, like somebody being rude or whatever. I mean, it's rude if you do X, Y, Z. Well, that's a rule that we have. I mean, no one's going to jail for that, but that's the idea, is that existed. The simple definition of a lady or gentleman is someone who makes someone the most comfortable they can. I can't believe I'm actually quoting Blast from the Past, that movie from like the 90s right there. But anyway, the point still stands. But we consider the rules of good manners are made to try to make people as comfortable as possible, to give them a script so they know what to do and they don't injure others on accident. This has been screwed all to heck recently, but that's beside the point. The point, though, is that this is a recognition that those manners existed for something, to some end, and trying to, as Jordan Peterson would say, rescue the father, go back and say, okay, what are these things trying to serve and how can I better serve them? Of course, to that same end, postmoderns and various other kinds of bad actors can take those and say you're not living up to your highest values and then destroy the whole thing. Deconstructionism is never improvement because it's much easier to knock over the blocks than to build new blocks of your own that work well. Matter of fact, it's almost impossible to make a well-working system, and once you destroy one that works well, it's almost impossible to fix it. So this is the recognition that one has to have in trying to also protect the society. But the final stage for Kohlberg is where one takes this abstract reasoning and uses it from a specific principle. Is not just the idea of self-creation that I think this whole section is. I mean, this whole phase is about self-creation, but it's not just like we can create the world as we want, but also that there has to be some kind of universal philosophic ethic that we have to apply. So Immanuel Kant often comes up, don't do anything that you wouldn't think should be universal law based on your will alone. That's fine. I have some issues with that, but really it is, I'm trying to be the kind of person, and I constrain myself to live in such a way as if everyone was also similarly constrained, then the world would be great. And this is obviously the root of religious viewpoints, because that's going to provide for us a philosophic stance, a meta-ethic by which we can judge what kinds of societies we want to create on the 5th level. So that's the 6th level. So that's all of Maslow put together in his 6 stages his 5 stages compared to all of Kohlberg put together in his 6 stages. And you can see how they match, and then they go astray right when one has to come up with the question of where the individual fits with society. But now I want to take another step and add Soren Kierkegaard. Now, Kierkegaard has 3 different steps. His philosophy is really fun to try to work out what he actually thinks, because he would very often write in pseudonyms. He would write an entire book by a fictional author. And the point wasn't to obscure his name. The point was this person has his own set of his or her. I don't know if he wrote with any female pseudonyms, but this person that I'm writing as has their own set of beliefs that may be different from mine as the author. And often he would write whole books about things that he didn't believe in. And that's perfectly seen in the aesthetic, in either or. When we have the 2 characters, we have the aesthetic and we have the judge. Now, Judge Wilhelm is a law and order kind of guy, and the aesthetic is a seek pleasures kind of guy, but not just the, sit on the couch, scratch yourself while you're watching the game and drink a lot of beer kind of aesthetic, although that would be qualify in the lower levels. But in the higher levels this character would go to an opera and leave before the ending, because once he saw the ending, he would know what happened and he would judge the whole piece completed. He would rather allow there to be the opening of possibility, because possibility is more entertaining, and thus create multiple endings to the opera so that he wouldn't have to be stuck with just one and could get more pleasure out of there. And he would talk about rotating your pleasure so you don't get bored. But really, he's fighting off his own existential angst and his own nihilism at the inability of the world to ever fully satiate or be entertaining enough to keep us all fully involved. But okay, I may be wandering off topic there anyway. But the point is, he's a great descriptor of Maslow's first two stages and Kohlberg's preconventional phase, or whatever he calls it. Stage? I don't know, whatever. So that would be the aesthetic sphere in Soren Kierkegaard, would encompass these ways of being, this idea of the aesthetic person wanting to, the morality would be avoiding pain and seeking pleasure, and the way of doing that would be looking, filling biological needs and having safety. So that we've put Maslow and Kohlberg together inside Kierkegaard. And now Kierkegaard talks about leaps of faith and whatever, but I'm going to actually say that there is a leap from that way of being to the next way of being, which is the ethical. And the ethical, as represented by Judge Wilhelm in Either Or, he's a judge and he looks back at the aesthetic person, and he's read the notes that the aesthetic person supposedly wrote or whatever, and he's like, you're ridiculous. Like, I find a lot greater pleasure in my commitments and the love of my wife and the development of a life and a person that I am, and the constraints that puts on me, the difficulties that creates, make it worth it because I have a sense of who I am and what I am in the world. So he argues for the ethical life, which is the conventional stage in Kohlberg, and is, interestingly enough, the Maslow, in Maslow, is that love and belongingness and self-esteem. So it's this whole picture of who you are as a person, but Judge Wilhelm doesn't have the ability to go beyond that one yet. He's in this conventional stage, but he doesn't really have he has some sense of self-creation, but it's really self-creation only based on the commitments and not really based on. It's a lot of that 1950s housewife kind of idea that one can be. Some people could be fully fulfilled in this, but some people are going to look from the outside and say, maybe that's too constraining for me. So the aesthetic would say that's too constraining, and it's either because this model is bad and could be improved, which is a higher level, or it's just because the person's a brat and they can't commit to things. See, so the ethical level, that ethical middle place where one makes commitments, can be judged by both the above and the below. And oftentimes, I think, particularly nowadays, people will steal the higher arguments, the upper level arguments from the post-conventional stage, and use them to attack the ethical, but only because they want to stay in the aesthetic. They want nothing but pleasure, and they don't want any commitments, and they want freedom from life, which is essentially suicide. All these death wishes, to use Freud's idea of not wanting to be constrained by our basic needs, not wanting to be constrained by commitments, and not wanting to be constrained by their humanity, which is essentially suicidal. So they use these higher level arguments to attack the ethical because they want to remain in the aesthetic. I see this quite often. But anyway, the point is that Kierkegaard says you have to take a leap. And I'm going to say, he really is just talking about the spiritual, but I'm going to say there's a leap that you have to take between the aesthetic to make a commitment to the ethical. And to really live in that range. A lot of people will make a commitment to the ethical because they think it's more fun, but that's just a pseudo-ethical. That's just I'm going to get married because I really love this person and everything's going to be great. And then they don't have the life that they pictured, and then they get divorced immediately because they don't recognize beauty in the commitment itself. The ability to make a lifelong pleasure or pain commitment is its own aesthetic. And at that point, once one finds beauty in the commitment and the sense of self developed by that commitment, then one is firmly entrenched in that ethical and is not just merely playing at it from the aesthetic sphere. So I think both of them, both the leap from that aesthetic sphere into the ethical sphere is a leap. That is something that has to be jumped into and stayed in. But you can I think it's definitely stages too, because you can definitely fall off of that one back into the aesthetic. Kierkegaard most often is referred to having a leap between the ethical sphere and the spiritual sphere, in which he uses Abraham as an example in Fear and Trembling, which I just loved the opening of that book. The whole discussion is amazing. In Fear and Trembling, he talks about how Abraham is making a commitment to God, and then does this thing, attempts to sacrifice Isaac, but he does in doing this, he condemns himself. He condemns his own future. This is all he has in the world, and he's willing to give it up. Now, that sounds romantic in a sense of like, oh, look at the amazing way he's willing to sacrifice and his amazing love for God to give up his only son. But then there's also the sense in which, okay, that's attempted murder at the very least, or actual murder if he follows through on it. And if nothing else, everybody's going to have him committed to a madhouse for being schizophrenic because he's hearing voices and he's going to try to kill people because of them. There's a way in which the judgments of the world on him are correct. And he should go to jail or should whatever if that's the case. If he follows through on this, then of course God spares him, and by that says that there's a level of sacrifice that we don't need to do, or that someone else will take on, which would be God or some universal ethic, is essentially another non-theistic way of interpreting that event. But the point being that there's a leap that has to be taken there of, I don't know how this is going to turn out. And it's beyond my ethical or even cognitive capacity to know what's going on here. This is just, and this goes back to my first lecture in which I talk about our insufficiency and the need for self-doubt, because that's the only way to freedom, because knowledge is a lie, and our faith is the only way in which we can operate. We have to have faith that what we have experienced will make sense in the future, but we are, as finite beings, we cannot say we actually know because we could always be deceived or confused. And faith is a stronger situation, but I'm not going to try to rehash the argument that I would be making in lecture 2 here, but whatever. If I post that one, go find lecture 2. Anyway, because faith is greater than knowledge, and knowledge is unscientific. Faith is actually scientific. There's another whatever. Anyway, the point is that this is an act of self-determination as one leaps out of the rational into the irrational, but not just irrational, though, because that's also right hemispheric. It's leaping into the thing that we can only experience and can't understand. As Kierkegaard says, it's like the fraud, like you drink your keg of ale here, or something. Keg's the wrong word. I don't drink enough to know the words. Your tankard of ale. This is the reference I have involves goblins or something. I don't know. But you drink your tankard of ale and there's a frog at the bottom, and it's like, what the frick is that? But this is what experience is actually like. It's incomprehensible to some degree. And we have to come to terms with its incomprehensibility. And the fact that we can't always have an ethical, moral, or logical system to apply to every circumstance. Some things just have to be experienced, and some things we just have to go on our best guess. And this is where faith is appropriately brought into play and acted upon. And so Abraham here is demonstrating what we do in the fact that we recognize we are finite beings and cannot understand the consequences of everything, but yet still have to act. So to continue on, though, there's an interesting connection here also with Bloom's taxonomy, which also has 6 stages. I'll just throw this out because it's interesting, but like remembering, obviously is the bottom stage for Bloom's taxonomy. Remembering, I have to be able to remember what food is something I can take in, what's going to be poisonous, whether it was good or bad in the past. This is also can be a very body-based memory, because that's, sense memory after you get sick with something will definitely stand out, so you can't eat that again. Understanding how to get access to it or what will happen in the future, the understanding and the application of the mere memory. Thus, one is able to predict what will be safe in the future and how to create that safety. From there, Bloom's taxonomy goes into applying, which works really well with Kohlberg's version of coming up with a system of law and order, and analyzing, which is the development of that ability to compare and contrast and to separate into boxes. But that doesn't really give you a larger picture, which comes in from the upper level Bloom's taxonomy, which is the evaluating and creating. And as I mentioned before, that's the creative potentials. But all of these really work very well together, and you can see how the human being develops across dimensions and integrates the 3 different operating systems in a way to continue to meet the lower level needs and then develop higher level needs upon them. And as one goes up in the developmental levels, getting to the highest level of evaluating and creating, then one is able to judge the very act of meeting the lower level needs, and maybe find that they're not as important as before. We are able to act as more than just animals. Thus, Gandhi can go on hunger strikes and deprive himself of his lower level needs based on a higher level need of and a moral understanding of what can affect society and how to reshape society with a nonviolent action. Again, I forgot, I didn't have notes. So I forgot that I was saying that the first I would see is not just the whole thing I would call is a self-actualization drive that starts from the bottom and pushes one forward toward eudaimonia. But Maslow's, I would say, is very physical related, how one interacts with the world. Although Kohlberg says his is an ethical system, I really feel like this is more an empathy drive. It's an ability to connect with the experiences of others in a more complete way, and a recognition of our similarities to other human beings and their experiences. One has to have at least a small amount of empathy just to accomplish the lowest level of recognition of fairness. Like, what are they getting and where am I getting? And if it's anything more complex than just measuring the amount of cake that one has, then that concept also starts creating some empathy. But that also allows one to use that empathy as a bludgeon on people who are being held accountable for maintaining that balance, such as parents. And so this is, I think, something we see a lot with teachers, although it's a larger societal application now. But, children will use that. It's not fair to bludgeon their teacher into essentially attacking some other student in the classroom, because life can never be exactly fair, and that's always a great hammer to use against other people. So to bring this around full circle, the idea of moving between levels and how one is able to progressively, especially in the Kierkegaardian sense, take those leaps between these spaces, it requires us to get closure to previous events, so we're not just simply reliving previous scripts in our lives, not simply interacting with others the way we interacted with our parents or the way our siblings interacted with us, or based on the expectations our society had for us when we were children that we continue to act on now. As these things get outdated, they should be replaced. But it's hard for us to replace because we are attracted to those safety level needs, which has that lower level expectation of recognizing and following through on a script. There's also a concept I have that I'm not sure, I don't think it should go in this lecture, but I have of early automation. We come, rather than mastering or creating, when we come to learning a skill, rather than aiming at mastery or creating, we tend to aim at early automation. As quickly as we can move it from the thinking process to making it something we can do without thinking, then we stop working on it. And this also traps us in patterns all across our experience, not just in learning how to play chess or to do some carpentry or something, but it also interferes with our ability to progress socially and to interact with others better and develop social skills. As we automate our experiences, this is also part of the idea of manners, again, as I mentioned before. As we come up with, okay, I should be able to do X, Y, and Z, and then people shouldn't be uncomfortable, and I should have that expectation that if I'm fulfilling my basic deontological expectations socially, that they should not be upset at me. But then people are still upset at me, and then I have to try to navigate what that means. But, well, if they're expecting too much from me, then that's their fault, and blah, blah, blah. But the point is that, to some extent, this early automating it before we have mastered the skill interferes with our developmental process across the board, no matter what dimension you're looking at, whether you're looking at the physical skills, whether you're looking at the emotional skills, or whether you're looking at intellectual thought processes. This is why people engage in, this is why CBT is effective in recognizing cognitive distortions and how they occur. They occur because people have given up on the process of thinking far too early. They've automated it, particularly in regards to politics, in which one would just say other team bad and not actually process the multivariate experiences that those people might have and how to understand them within a context that would make sense. So this early automation injures the way one thinks about, they must do that because they're racist, or they must do that because they're communist, and rather than trying to figure out what the actual person thinks. That early automation injures the thought process. That early automation injures the emotional developmental process in not trying to figure out what, either from ourselves internally, what our emotions are telling us in terms of information, or not recognizing the social skills involved in the manipulation of patterns when interacting with others to make the best social ends possible. Manipulation used in a non-moralistic way there, just the interaction with multiple items socially to result in whatever you're trying to accomplish. And also, again, in the physical skills, people will give up on drawing when they're in like 6th or 7th grade, and it's like, dude, you've only been able to sign your name for like 4 years here. You can't expect yourself to be able to be a good drawer. But not putting in that original time to get past the hump of developing comfort with that. You have to get beyond just we move towards automation so quickly that we never develop a good understanding of what we're doing at all. And this, again, is the opposite of free will. That's why I said free will is self-conscious self-criticism, which is something that would come from lecture 2. The self-conscious self-criticism is the only way we can free ourselves from our bad habits, from reliving past bad experiences, from our baggage, from our past painful learning. We have to criticize ourselves, and that's painful. That's difficult because, as Jung said, what you most need is where you least want to look to find it. But that's why it's there. It's the thing you need most is going to be where you don't want to look, because where else would it be? It's going to be everywhere you've already looked already, right? So that's going to be in the painful and difficult experiences. So our self-conscious self-criticism, it's unpleasant. It's self-conscious in the sense of being on stage in front of people, trying to perform and having to look at yourself. This is the way one frees oneself up to recognize the errors one makes, to continue to perfect a skill, to recognize you don't know everything and we're operating on faith. And the fact that we don't know everything means that I need to continually explore where I could have gone wrong and what I can improve. And as I continue to improve that, then I can move up the stages and more easily accomplish having my needs met. As I accomplish having those needs met, and this goes back to the closure process that I've talked about in other videos, but would specifically talk about in lecture 3 about emotions, the way we come up with closure and move to the next levels up these stages of eudaimonia are to intentionally recognize having had our needs met, intentionally saying this is successful, this isn't successful, and I have enough experience of that, enough recognition and watching myself be successful that I can say, I think I'm good at that, or I think I can at least handle that, and I can handle it well enough that I can move to the next level, or I can try something harder. That's the place at which one moves up these levels. When I say I'm ready for the next challenge, and am ready to take a leap, particularly in the Kierkegaardian idea of there really is no connection between the rewards of the ethical life that is committed to action and constrained in the way one will act, and the aesthetic life in which one will act any way that feels pleasurable. These are not really compatible, but one is certainly able to contain the other, while the ethical is certainly able to contain the aesthetic, but the aesthetic will always be baffled by the ethical. And this is also how sociopaths operate. They can never understand the joy possible through commitment and constraint, and thus they think everybody else is ridiculous, but then also don't work well in teams. Anyway, I think that's a good... that seems like I've covered everything that I wanted to cover in this lecture. I can't remember anything else that I would have left off. Again, I started off with 5 bullet points. Yeah, start off with 5 bullet points, and that's been about it. And they're not even complete sentences. They're just like the various things that I wanted to mention. Anyway, tell me how I did. I can tell already that I was way too excited, and I really need to get that NPR voice where I can speak more fluidly as well as calmly and in a soothing way. We'll see how that goes in the future. Gosh, man. Yeah, if I get interested in something, I just go high energy. It's if I ever wanted to record anything useful and long term, I can't do that because then I have to go back and re-edit because I feel like an idiot having yammered on like the 10th Doctor Who. But anyway, okay, well, good enough for now. Good talking to you. Please leave any comments or thoughts you have wherever you can find it. Find me on Gab because that's where I most enjoy being. But talk to you later.